Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Effortless Linguistics Journey podcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Jessica.
Today, we're tackling something that can be a real challenge for English learners: memorizing.
Memorizing vocabulary is a hard challenge, but it's one we can overcome. So, Ryan, let's start with the basics. What's the biggest mistake people make when trying to learn new words?
I think the biggest mistake is memorizing words in isolation. It's like trying to remember a person's name without ever seeing their face or knowing anything about them. It just doesn't work very well.
So, what's the alternative?
Contextual learning is key. Instead of just learning a word and its definition, learn it in a sentence. See how it's used in a real situation. Think about it. When you learned your first language, you didn't memorize lists of words, right? You heard them in conversations and stories, and you figured out their meaning from the context. It's the same with English.
That makes so much sense. How can our listeners put this into practice?
Reading is your best friend. Read books, articles, and even news websites in English. The more you read, the more you'll see words used in different ways, and the more you'll start to understand their nuances. Don't worry about understanding every single word at first. Focus on getting the general idea and try to guess the meaning of unfamiliar words from the surrounding text.
Great advice. So, reading is a must. What else can people do?
Repetition is essential. You've probably heard this before, but it's true. You can't just see a word once and expect to remember it forever. You need to see it again and again. But it's not just about passively reading a list. You need to use the words actively.
How can people actively use new words?
Write them down in your sentences. Try to use them in conversations. Even just thinking about how you would use a word can help solidify it in your memory. The more you use a word, the more natural it will become.
So, practice makes perfect?
Exactly. And don't forget to review. Go back and look at the words you've learned regularly. The more you review, the stronger the memory will become.
Okay, so we've got contextual learning and repetition. What's next?
Personalization is important. Try to connect new words to your own life. If you learn a word that relates to your hobbies or interests, you're much more likely to remember it. Make the learning process personal and meaningful.
That's a great point. Find ways to make the words relevant to you.
Exactly. And everyone learns differently. Experiment with different methods and see what works best for you. Some people like flashcards, while others prefer learning words in context. Find your learning style and stick with it.
Speaking of flashcards, they're a pretty popular tool, right?
Definitely. Flashcards can be very helpful. You can use traditional paper flashcards, or you can use digital flashcards with apps like Anki or Memrise. These apps are great because they use something called spaced repetition, which helps you review words at the optimal time.
I've heard good things about those apps. What about active recall? That sounds interesting.
Active recall is all about testing yourself. Don't just passively read through lists of words. Try to remember the meaning of a word without looking it up. You can use flashcards for this, or you can just quiz yourself mentally. The act of trying to remember the word strengthens the memory.
It's like exercising your brain muscles.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to solidify your understanding is to teach someone else. If you can explain a word to someone else, you know it.
That's a fantastic tip. Now, let's talk about mnemonic devices. What are those?
Mnemonic devices are memory tricks. They help you remember things by creating associations. For example, you could create a mental image or a rhyme to remember a word. It's all about making the information more memorable.
So, it's like creating a little story around the word?
Exactly. And finally, we have immersion. This is a really powerful way to learn. Surround yourself with English as much as possible. Watch English movies and TV shows, listen to English music, and try to think in English.
So, live and breathe English?
Exactly. And the most important thing is to practice speaking. The more you speak English, the more you'll use the new words you've learned, and the better you'll remember them. Find a language partner or tutor to practice with. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn.
Any final tips for our listeners?
Just a few. Keep a vocabulary notebook. Write down new words, their definitions, and example sentences. There are also tons of great online resources you can use. And most importantly, make it fun. Learning vocabulary shouldn't be a chore. Find ways to make it enjoyable and you'll be much more likely to stick with it.
Fantastic advice, Ryan. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Let's use some of these ideas. We'll talk about 5 helpful words from our chat.
Good idea, Sarah. First, contextual learning. This means learning a word by seeing how it's used in a sentence, not just learning its meaning. Like run. I run every morning is different from the river runs through the valley. Run has different meanings in each sentence.
Right. Next is nuance. This is the small difference between similar words. Happy, joyful, and elated all mean good feelings, but they're a little different. Happy is just generally good, joyful is more exciting, and elated is super excited, like when you win something.
Perfect. Another word is repetition. You need to see words many times to remember them, like practicing piano. You need to repeat to get better.
Exactly. Then we have mnemonic device. These are tricks to help you remember, like making a picture in your mind of the word.
And last, immersion. This means surrounding yourself with English, like being underwater. English is all around you. Watch movies, listen to music, read books, and try to think in English.
Remember, the best way to learn is to use the words. Read, write, speak, and have fun.
That's all for today. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with more tips.